All right. It is 11:45 Central, so I think we're going to get going here, and I'm sure there will be other people joining as we get started. But yeah, just to start today, I wanted to recognize that the lands that I am occupying right now are at the junction of the Red and Assiniboine rivers and are located on Treaty 1 lands, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. The Manitoba Social Sciences Teachers Association, of which I'm president, does respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we do dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with the Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I am so excited to introduce our keynote for today. Niigaan James Sinclair is Anishinaabe from St. Peter, Winnipeg Is, an associate professor at the University of Manitoba. He is an award-winning writer, editor, and activist who was named one of Monocle Magazine's Canada's top 20 most influential people. And he won the 2018 Canadian Columnist of the Year at the National Newspaper Awards for his biweekly columns in the Winnipeg Free Press. In 2019, he won Peace Educator of the Year from the Peace and Justice Studies Association based at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He is an international media commentator as part of the Power Panel on CBC's Power and Politics and National Affairs panel on CBC's The Current. He is also a former secondary school teacher who has trained educators and students across Canada. And just to prove how close Manitobans are, less than 6 degrees of separation, Niigaan attended the high school in which I now teach. And I know quite a few people that went to school with Niigaan. And I have to ask you, Niigaan, just before we start, it does say in your Winnipeg Free Press bio that you are a recovering secondary school teacher. So I'm curious about that one. Regardless, without further ado, Dr. Niigaan Sinclair, thanks for being here with us today.
Okay, unmute myself. Okay, so bonjour de magaduk, Niigaan webidam digitakas, namago shendo dem, nimenwendam omayayan. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to come and hang out with you on SAG Day or Sage Day in Manitoba here, which is the Professional Development Day for Teachers. But I also know that we have an audience from all across the country. And so it's an honor to be here. My name is Niigaan Sinclair, and I'm a professor of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba. I'm the acting head of the department, as well as a columnist with the Free Press and a number of other things that I do. I'm going to show you some of those things that I do right here. So, when I was a high school teacher, I was a grade 9 teacher, and grade 9 actually through 12, but I was specifically hired to teach grade 9 English when I started, and drama. So I taught at a high school named Kelvin High School, and that school was a wonderful school, but in many different complexities within that school. Most famously, where Neil Young went. So if you know anything about Neil Young, like most schools have a picture of the Queen up in their office. Kelvin has a picture of Neil Young up in their office. So Kelvin is an interesting school because it's in one of the most affluent areas of Winnipeg. It's also one of the most popular public schools of Winnipeg. And so, and it's in the neighborhood that I live currently at the moment, so River Heights. And so right beside Kelvin is the St. Mary's Girls Academy. And right beside that is the Sherry Zedek Synagogue. So what have we learned about Kelvin so far? Very important cultural place. It's a place in which Neil Young, has a legacy there. There's a very affluent place, richest girls' private school in the city, in the neighborhood. Also right beside their very Jewish community. So when I started teaching at Kelvin, it was a very immersive Jewish experience. Most of my students were Jewish. Many of the parents were Jewish. I grew up in Selkirk, Manitoba, just north of Winnipeg. And, I certainly didn't know any Jewish people, or if I did, no one ever talked about it. Turns out that my best friend had a Jewish girlfriend in high school, but I certainly didn't go to the synagogue. I certainly didn't hang out at the house. I certainly didn't do anything that would get me to learn about Jewish culture, history, tradition. I'm an Anishinaabe. I'm Cree. I'm the most Manitoban of Manitobans. My dad comes from Norway House and Manikatagan. That's Ojibwe on Manikatagan, Cree from Norway House. And my mother comes from the British and the French. So British from Regina, the Warren family that connects to Britain, and then the Gamache family that connects all the way to Quebec and to France. So I've got 4 of the bingo card covered, Cree and Ojibwe in Manitoba, French and English through my mother. And then because my grandfather was enfranchised, my great-grandfather was enfranchised in order to buy land that was stolen from us. We were kicked off our land in 1907 by the government of Canada, the province of Manitoba, illegally removed by gunpoint. And for my grandfather, he came back and bought land on our former lands, but he had to enfranchise. He had to be a property owner. He had to give up his Indian status. So then we were Métis. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, my dad, in fact, was the vice president of the Métis of the Interlake. So I got the bingo card covered in Manitoba. Bingo for me, Métis, Cree, Ojibwe, British, and French. And of course, all I'm missing is Dakota, Lakota, Ojibwe, Inuit, Dene peoples, and of course all the other nations. But Sinclair is a Scottish name, so I've kind of got it all. Anyways, so I didn't certainly know any Jewish history, culture growing up, but when I was when I started my teaching career at Kelvin High School, I was asked to do the big musical. So the big musical, of course, was Fiddler on the Roof that year. And when Bob Wilkes, my principal, slid the script over to me, I didn't pick it because it's picked before the drama teacher. That's the way drama productions work, 6 months ahead. So before I was even hired, that was the musical they chose to do that year. 150 kids on stage, football team and a dance number, the whole 9 yards there. And so what was I expected to do? I expected to now teach the most Jewish musical of all time to the Jewish community. I'm an Anishinaabe. I don't know anything about Jewish history, culture, tradition. What do? Well, first thing I do is I run across the street to the Sherry Zedek Synagogue. I said to the rabbi, tell me everything you need to know. I need to know about being Jewish. I got 1 hour, go. And of course, I didn't learn anything during that hour other than the rabbi's a nice guy. And that night, I thought, okay, what am I going to do? Well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to copy the musical movie. And so I went to a Blockbuster. You all remember Blockbuster? I went to Blockbuster. I rented the movie, watched it 5 times, showed it to the kids, picked my cast, said, okay, guys, this is what we're going to do. We're just going to repeat the movie. Well, I don't know if you know this. This is probably going to be shocking for some of you. But Jewish people are a living, breathing culture. Like they change, they grow, they adapt, they adopt. I had kids saying to me, that's not the way we do marriages. That's not the way we pronounce the words. That's not the way that we decorate our homes, or that's not the costumes or clothing that we wear. What am I to do? Well, luckily, I had a kid say to me, well, I went to a wedding last weekend. I can help us with the wedding scene. And then I had another kid say, well, my mom teaches Hebrew classes on the weekends. She can come and help us learn the language. And another kid say, well, we have a bunch of stuff in our garage and my mom's a wonderful sewer. She can come in and help us to decorate the scenes and do all of the scenes and for the clothing for everybody. Pretty soon I had families, community leaders, I had language speakers all coming in, coordinating so that I could teach the most Jewish musical of all time to the Jewish community. And I certainly brought my expertise to the table. I'm amazing at musical, big numbers. I can put a show together. I know lighting, I knew blocking, I knew acting, But the fact is that, I had to put this musical on in December. Unlike most schools where you put it on in April, I put it on in December because, that was the requirement of Kelvin. Don't interrupt with the football season is what it is. And so I put the musical on in December, sold out. I wouldn't say it's a smash hit. It was just a decent musical, a strong musical. But guess who showed up the second night of the musical? The rabbi. And the rabbi turns to me and looks over and goes, not bad. And then he walks out of the gym. That's it. That was my total response review of Fiddler on the Roof when I was my first year as a teacher at Kelvin High School. But I can tell you this. I didn't offend anybody. I contributed to a community that I knew nothing about. And I learned how to teach the most Jewish musical of all time to the Jewish community. I didn't hurt anything. I didn't ruin the culture. I, in fact, built my relationships. And even today, I'm friends with most of those students. Many of them are now children who are going to school with my daughter. Many of them are students who have gone on to be professionals in the community. Some of them are parents that I just run into on the street. I'm even invited to come to the synagogue every year to be the community representative during the Holocaust Memorial. And now, today, Just today, I was at a gathering. I was at a meeting earlier here in Winnipeg, and who's there but the kid that I asked to be the fiddler on the roof? Meaning, he still remembers me, still called me Mr. Sinclair. I'm like, you can call me Niigaan now. I'm not your teacher anymore. But there he is. My point of saying that is, if that I can do that with Jewish history, culture, tradition, you can do that with Indigenous education. You're not going to become an expert. You're not going to be a PhD level scholar going out writing books. But what you are going to do is be a responsible, ethical individual, accepting the community and the reality of the community in which you're a part. And you will contribute in the ways in which you are expected to. Like we have a feast. You are expected to bring food to the feast like everybody else. And that all of us are to taste your food, to enjoy your food, and particularly to invite you back into the future. That's what Indigenous education is all about. And that's little things of what I want to talk to you about in terms of reconciliation for now, for this place, for today. I'm just going to open up my slides here. When we talk a little bit about allyship and we talk a little bit about, our relationships with each other, the key here is understanding that you must walk the talk. It's not just enough to say words, but you must live it. This is the work that I do with what's called the Mama Bear Clan here in Winnipeg. The Mama Bear Clan is a volunteer-run organization through the North Point Douglas Women's Center. We do work with the most marginalized and oppressed of our community, meaning those who are without homes, who are living on the streets. 90% of those Indigenous. And so unsurprisingly, most of us who are volunteers, most of us who are doing work with the Mama Bear Clan, like many of the community organizations, that's things like the Bear Clan or Initiative Native or the Thunderbird Group, or, there's lots of different groups who are working in downtown Winnipeg, but we are Indigenous run. We are run by Indigenous women, grandmothers in particular. And what we do is we go out and we offer 4 things. One of them is not offered by anybody else, meaning that anyone from the social justice, the poverty organizations of the city. Indigenous organizations offer this one thing that no one else offers. We offer food, a sandwich, and we have a principle that we bring food to people. We don't expect people to, in a demeaning, horrible experience, to wait 2 hours to get a bed, 2 hours to get a sandwich, 2 hours to just simply get a Band-Aid. In fact, that's insulting. We take our food to our relatives. Second, we tell people that they are important, that we love them, that we care about them. Third thing, we offer a smudge. And then fourth is that we offer them resources and supports if they wish to get assistance for life. That one element of love is the one thing that has not been given to Indigenous peoples from this society, from this world, from this community, this country, since the very first moment of Confederation. Still isn't. And in fact, the evidence is that more Indigenous peoples are sleeping on the streets, more Indigenous peoples are in the child welfare system, more Indigenous peoples are murdered and missing, both men and women, than anyone else. We still live in a society where there is a perpetuity, a perpetuation of racism that is the foundation of this place. Rebuilding these relationships involves rebuilding our ceremonies and rebuilding who we are. And most of you will have seen me on TV with Power and Politics and with different others, organizations and agencies and so on. But my proudest work is really with the Forks National Historical Site. I'm the Indigenous curator with the Forks. I can see somebody raising their hand. I don't know if do we want to do questions right now? Like, I'm totally fine with questions if we want. Kevin, do you want to just control that if you want? Or
Yep.
I see 2 participants raising their hand, which is totally fine. Do you want me to clarify anything? Or
Yeah, maybe if we could put questions in the chat and then I could refer them to Dr. Sinclair.
Okay, yeah, I don't mind handling questions, but I'm just going to get through a few different things here, and then maybe we can go to some comments. And also, I have a plenary too, I have a discussion just after this too, so happy to do it there as well. But my happiest work and my most satisfying work is with the Forks National Historical Site, where we, for the first time in 150 years, have brought a Medewan Lodge, or what we call a wigwamic, which is a wigwam to back to that site, and we have to remember, of course, that it's only 50 years ago that we would have been arrested for doing this. It cost, several $100,000 for the Forks to commit to in the Indigenous community to help build relationships. And we've built this site so that all of our community, everyone, can see what is the historical and intellectual tenets of this place. They can see what it is to live in this place. Like, what is the original spaces that built treaty? What are the places that built relationships? And then what are the intellectual tenets? What are the first universities, then the universities that are still in operation today? What are the intellectual ways that we have operated? So, and of course, we use the language, ceremonies in this space. And particularly what we've done is we've really tried to make this space an availability for everybody. This is particularly important for us to talk about who we are and the spaces in which we live because of recent events, but always, in fact, but particularly because of recent events, because there's been a lot of ink, a lot of column inches, a lot of conversations on TV, and I've been a part of a lot of them, talking about the discoveries at residential schools. And of course, these are discoveries simply for Canadians. For Indigenous peoples, these are things that we already knew about. We just perhaps didn't know where the children were. Every single Indigenous community has a story of lost children. And so the fact is that we knew that our children were stolen. We knew that our children were killed and murdered. We know that our children never came home. But the fact is that we didn't quite know where they are. And in many cases, we still don't know. So that's where the ground penetrating radar came in. That's where the discoveries at Kamloops or Cowessess or Brandon took place. There's upwards now in over 6,000 grave sites, unmarked grave sites that have been uncovered on residential school sites and in some cases boarding school sites in the northern United States. And so we have a real issue here in that Canadians are only waking up to the truth of the spaces in which we live, whereas Indigenous peoples have been talking about this for a very long period of time. And all of the things that I've mentioned so far, the fact that we are perpetually in poverty, we are in this constant state of erasure and marginalization within society, we are in this constant state of struggles to be seen, makes territorial acknowledgements so important. Because while territorial acknowledgements, and I was on the Current yesterday morning talking about this, as that discussion played out, and you can see that online. It's a really great discussion with Hayden King and I pronounce your name wrong, but she's a CBC Mohawk reporter, which is a wonderful work that she's done. These discoveries within these communities are important because what they do is they remind us to see one another. And then therefore we must act differently. That's what a territorial acknowledgement does. It talks about who we can see and then how we must act accordingly. And across the country, as we are doing that within our spaces that we are building together, like the Lodge at the Forks, like the Wigwam at the Forks, we are recognizing and using that moment with those orange ribbons to recognize those children are left behind. And I'm sometimes asked, when are you going to stop putting up these orange ribbons all over the place, or when are we going to move on, or when are Indigenous peoples going to get over it? There is no getting over it. There is no forgetting. There is only living. There is only doing. And so we have to keep talking about it. We have to keep engaging it, and we have to particularly do it for our children because of this. At my daughter's school on September 29th, because September 30th was a holiday here, the very first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, my daughter's school went out and visited the only urban residential school in the country, which is about 15-minute walks from the very place that I taught Fiddler on the Roof way back in the year 2000. And now, 2021, my daughter's now a grade 10 student. In fact, she's coming in the room in a minute. I'll get her to wave. But she led a ceremony with her other colleagues and her students at Kelvin High School to take a walk to smudge that location, to smudge each other, and then most importantly, to talk about what it means to live in spaces together, to engage the processes of what it means to be responsible and ethical, and most importantly, to realize that that is the curriculum itself. It's not about memorizing how many residential schools are. It's not about talking and trying to figure out, what's a map where we can pinpoint which residential schools wherever. It's about talking about what does it mean now? Like, what does it mean now to have residential schools in our communities? How has that formed our relationships with each other? What can we do today to build our relationships, to take a step? And in the case of my daughter, is offering a smudge. It's offering a song. In the case of that school, it's about sitting together and listening, loving, learning. That's the kind of revolutionary movement that's happening right here in Treaty 1. And I'm very pleased to say that, I come from a community that I'm very, very proud of. I'm very proud of this place. And on the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, the birth of a national holiday, which not many of us get to see, most of us have our holidays pre-chosen for us, but we actually get in this lifetime an opportunity to choose and to pick and to support a holiday that is being birthed right before our very eyes. On this day of National Truth and Reconciliation, Treaty 1 held the largest gathering in the country. Let me say that again. It was not Toronto. It was not Montreal. In fact, if you saw the news this week, Toronto and Montreal still debating whether they should do territorial acknowledgements. What year are you talking about? Or what year are you living in? The fact is that we are living together in spaces, and we got to get beyond just seeing each other. We got to take some action. And, here in Treaty 1, I'm not telling you that the world was changed on September 30th, but 10,000 people walked in the streets. 10,000 people joined together and say, we can be more than what we've inherited. And 10,000 people showed solidarity with each other, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and said, we want to build something. We want to do something. And here's what we want to do. The first step is taking a step. Walking together, learning from one another, listening. That's what this is all about. If we were to say what is reconciliation? What is reconciliation? What is it that we're trying to talk about when we're doing this in our schooling, right? It's really ultimately about relationships. And, in all Indigenous gatherings, it's ultimately about relationships. Everything that you can see, and I'm sure that I've heard people talk about it. I've seen your stuff on Twitter for the conference. People have been talking about relationships. Well, I'm going to explain to you how it works in terms of the material. So, in tobacco, for example, tobacco is about the building of a relationship. When a gift is offered, or what we refer to as a bagaginan, that bagaginan is offered in such a way to build a relationship with someone. It must be chosen to be accepted, meaning a bagaginan is something where I offer it to you, but you must choose to pick it up. It's different than the word bagadinan, which is like I set it down or I put it over there. Bagaginan means I've offered it to you. I'm setting it down for you to pick up. This asema, tobacco, is something in which we have already picked up, meaning that we have been offered a relationship with the earth, with our seeds, with our time, with our blood, with our sweat, with our tears, because tobacco is very difficult to grow. It takes hundreds of hours to grow it. And then when you get this tiny little pinch, you just give it away. And when you give it to someone and when they choose to pick it up, they are accepting that hundreds of hours you have partaken, you've prepared to build that relationship. And then you've basically said, I commit to you in that relationship, because that word miigwech is a commitment. Miigwech doesn't mean thank you when you say miigwech. Miigwech means I will give you back, or I will give it on. That's where the verb miigwe comes from, I give. So miigwech means it's like a legal commitment. I commit that I will commit to a relationship with you for the path of this tobacco. And so that tobacco then therefore represents a relationship, which is for us law. That's the point. It's like people say, oh, the power of your word, or the power of your promise, or the fulfillment of your responsibility, the understanding of your responsibility. Well, not everybody needs to understand fully one's agreement, but one definitely has got to stay in the room. You have to stay in the room when you share tobacco. You don't give up on one another. You don't abandon one another. And you certainly don't create a society that marginalizes, oppresses, and erases people. What you do when you share tobacco is you commit to seeing each other forever. Oh, and by the way, this is the story of Manitoba. The entire story of Manitoba begins with tobacco. It begins in the 1817 Selkirk Treaty, Pegwith-Selkirk Treaty, a negotiated treaty, the very first land settlement in Western Canada. It's the very first point in which Indigenous peoples offered spaces to non-Indigenous peoples for places to live along the river. That's the dots. And in particular, it was signed using the dodems. So before Treaty 1, Treaty 1 is an important treaty, of course, but it's only built off of the Selkirk Treaty. The Selkirk Treaty is the first treaty of Manitoba. It is really the only treaty. And the only treaty, what I mean by that is not to say that the Treaty 1 doesn't matter, or it's that the Treaty 1 is built on the Selkirk Treaty's principles, which is that with that signing of those dodems, what Peguis was saying to Selkirk was, these are those who you share that land with. These are those you have responsibilities to. And most importantly, it's not just the bears and the martens, as you can see here, or the fish or the guinevere, the snake. It is the rocks, the trees, the water, the earth, and that you are sharing those relationships with that space. So polluting the water is a treaty violation. Disrespecting and creating pipelines that destroy the air or the earth is a treaty violation. Dumping or deforesting the entirety of southern Manitoba is a treaty violation. Much in the same way that what Peguis asked Selkirk to do was to every year you must come back and present tobacco. As I have presented you this land to live on, you must present tobacco. And that is how Manitoba came to be, through that message of tobacco, that if we put time into one another, that will be ultimately how we forge peace, kindness, and a future in this place. That's what Manitoba is supposed to be all about. But of course, what Selkirk did, which is what most Europeans did when they imagined treaties, is they imagined them as land purchases or property creating vehicles, or the ability of turning Indigenous peoples and dumping them onto reserves over here, where the fact is that was not the intention of what the treaty was in the first place. And if the Bagajanan, the offering, was understood or at least committed to, or people stayed in the room together, then they would have learned that together. But Selkirk offered tobacco once, took off to Montreal, died soon after that. And unfortunately, like many situations involving this country, Indigenous peoples were cast aside and forgotten about. And unfortunately, this is a story that makes up much of what we now call of as Canada. When we teach our children, as social studies teachers, I thought I would bring this up for you, because I think this is an important message for all of us to think about, because when we talk about social studies, we talk about nationhood, we talk about sovereignty, we talk about, GDP and all this kind of stuff. The fact is that, we teach a very one-dimensional way of viewing the world, even if we think that it is the most open way possible. We can talk about the United Nations, we can talk about multiculturalism, we can talk about democracy. We can talk about, a map, and we can show people the map of spaces, and we can say, these are the maps in which we can learn about this place, and we can learn all the intricacies, and this is our base level knowledge. But do we really see what is the world around us? Like, do we really see this? Have we taught what is the much larger story about North America, South America, which is that Canada and the United States are frankly new kids in the block? They're just basically new entities created out of the Bretton Woods Agreement, the nation state idea, arguably maybe feudalism, like the whole purpose of what we're talking about in social studies is supposed to be about relationships in a space, how that space operates, and then ultimately how it may operate into the future, right? Everything fits into that criteria, right? But the fact is that we really only teach a very one-dimensional way of thinking about North America. We don't talk about it, and if we do talk about this, we talk about it in terms of the past. We don't talk about it in terms of the present, but right underneath the concrete is this story. Right within our very languages is this story. Right within our very policies is this story. Like, for example, if we just take a look at, for example, the map of nativeland.ca, if you take a look at that map, and it's a really wonderful website, I put the link right there, check it out. Nativeland.ca will show you all the different Indigenous territories. And two things that you'll notice that are really important. One is that the Indigenous nations overlap. And second is that they seem to inhabit the same space, but yet maintain their sovereignty. Like, what's that about? How can two nations exist in the same space? Like, for example, I want you just to imagine that, how's that worked out in the world so far? We'll say the Middle East. How's that working on the Middle East? Two nations inhabiting the same space. Yeah, not well. How's that working out in Europe? Well, At the very most, the European Union is a fragile entity at best, and everybody's competing and trying to undermine one another for the most part. Especially, and then people just leave the room. They just take off, like Brexit, right? Well, Indigenous nations have this inherent principle around collective, community, and frankly, tobacco. Tobacco is not the every method that we use, but it's a good method to talk about to sort of bring a basis up. When tobacco is shared, the journey is begun, meaning that space is shared permanently for the duration of that relationship. And one of the amazing things is you can see Indigenous nations sharing space all across North America, but yet maintaining their sovereignty, because much like I'll give you an example, the Ojibwe and the Cree here in Manitoba. They used to meet every year in and around Gimli, and when they do that, they would negotiate the borders, right? And many different nations did this as well, but they would negotiate the borders every single year. So the Cree would turn to the Anishinaabe and say, "Where are we going to put the borders this year?" And the Cree would be like, "Well, we had some more babies, so we need some more hunting, fishing areas." And the Ojibwe would be like, "Okay, well, we had some deaths, so tell you what, this year we'll move the border from the tree line to the shoreline. And next year we'll come back and revisit that after we've traded gifts and offered relationships and revisited tobacco, and we had tobacco to each other again." Well, I want you just to imagine, like, what would that look like if Justin Trudeau phoned up Joe Biden, Donald Trump, whoever the heck it is this week, and say, "Oh, where are we going to put the border this year?" Like, do you think that if America got some land, or Canada for that matter, they would give it back? No, because the competitive nature of nation states is individualism. It's based on Western capitalism. It's particularly based in property acquisition, going all the way back to the barons and the lords and ladies, and frankly, the king empire. When a nation is built on empire, then it's inherently about us and them. And them, in this case, happens to be Indigenous peoples. However much we can take, we must therefore then isolate and hopefully eradicate. Hopefully they just die off. And that's basically the reserve system. Well, Indigenous nations don't have that idea. What they have is the notion of tobacco shared means that we must commit to one another. Therefore, I'm invested in the survival of the Cree people. The Cree need to survive in order for me to survive. Oh, and the side benefit of that is there's no wars, because if they can eat, then they won't fight us. If they can be safe and comfortable, then they'll probably help us if we ever get struggling. Oh, and by the way, it also means that all the animals get to survive. That means all the earth and water, when we work together, is taken care of. And probably the most important of all, which is that we all have long lives. Peace, justice, fairness. When we communicate, when we commit to one another, when we learn from one another. Not when we lock people off into a bathroom in the house and say, "You can never leave. Oh, and by the way, we're going to take your children and we're going to teach them everything about the bathroom sucks." That's the challenge here, is that we come from a world in which there is high basis of divisions in the normalcy of what we consider to be Canada's very foundation. The Royal Proclamation is the best example, where the king said, "Everything is mine." And then this is all the things that we consider to be normal. It's in the very textbooks. It's in the very textbooks itself where we say that these are the only nations that matter. These are the ones that don't matter. Here's the things that the languages that matter. Here's the ones that don't. And also, let's be very clear here. There is nothing that is Canadian that isn't Indigenous invented. Nothing. Zero. Not anything. And what I mean by that is not to say just the bad stuff, meaning the economy built on Indigenous land, most of it stolen, but the fact that democracy was an Indigenous invention. Like, Europeans did not come up with the idea that there would be one person, one vote. Like Indigenous peoples did. It was called the Circle. The Iroquois Confederacy came up with the Great League of Nations, and the Great League of Peace, and that created the U.S. Constitution, so-called democracy, right? Where did healthcare come from? Let's ask that question. Where did the idea that we put all of our medicines in a pile, and then we make sure that those who are the most oppressed, those are the most needing, get the medicines first? We all share that responsibility. Well, newsflash, it's not a society where a king is in charge. A society where a king is or queen is in charge, or the Pope, means that it's one person who decides the rules for everybody. It's a bit of a dictatorship, frankly. It's a society in which there is the locus of power centered around one individual, or perhaps a family of individuals, or a group of individuals who we'll call lords and ladies, right? The fact is that healthcare was an indigenous invention. Yeah, yes, Europeans had something to say along the way, yes, of course, but everything we think of as Canadian, healthcare, democracy, peacekeeping, like who came up with the idea that we would feed the elders first? We'd feed the women, we'd feed the children, then finally we'd feed the men, and the very last person we would feed would be the chiefs, right? Or that the person who would come into a community, we would let them maintain their culture. We would make sure that they bring their things to that feast. They bring their food, they bring their language, they bring their spirituality to that feast. Another word for that's called multiculturalism. Indigenous peoples invented that too. My point of saying it is that we have an inherent sense of forgettance or denial, and that goes within the very elements of society, and it's a real problem. It's a real problem that has led to all of these things. The way treaties have operated, the way residential schools have operated. I'm not here to give you a history lesson. I'm talking to a bunch of history teachers here. But I can tell you that, within the very basis, it makes a kind of logicalness where we see poverty and we absolutely 100% understand it. It comes from the very king in 1763 that said, everything is mine and I will lock people over here on this reserve because they are my subjects. Oh, by the way, they are not the subjects like I think of as British subjects, but they are kind of like children. And if I give them food and clothing, they'll be lucky. If I let them have economy, they'll be lucky. If I let them move around, they'll be lucky. But for the most part, I'm going to make sure that they're under control. We'll call those the Indian agents. And so, the British North America Act makes this law, makes this normal within our everyday world itself. And that's the challenge here, is that we also have these things called treaties, like the Selkirk Treaty or Treaty 1. And I know that many of you have been talking about treaties during the duration of this conference. It gives us a sense of something different. Like, treaties are not based in the Bretton Woods idea of nation sovereignty, of individualism, capital accumulation, and property. They're based in something else. They're based in a sense that you could have two people sharing space, committing to a relationship that looks like tobacco. That looks like we're going to stay in the room. That looks like we're going to build our homes together. These are the treaty metals after Treaty 3, by the way. That we're going to build homes together. We're going to build a future together. And it's a sunrise, although it may just be that Europeans were dealing with it in a kind of two-eyed way, and that they were also thinking that this might be a sunset. That I don't have to worry about them for a while, because that would certainly explain the nefariousness. But it also gives us a vision of reconciliation. Like, when we talk about reconciliation, there's hundreds of different topics that we can talk about. And I'm sure that you've talked about them in many different sessions during this conference. Certainly I've talked about them with teachers and different ways. And, I could talk to you about the Mama Bear Clan and poverty. I could talk to you about the ways ceremonies are operating, the calls to action 1 through 42, which are institutions that are most challenging to us. That's child welfare, that's justice, that's education, that's language and culture, that's health. The fact that we have many different challenges. We still have a government that is continuing to refuse to compensate Indigenous children for discrimination that the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal continues to find them guilty for over and over and over again. And instead of doing something about it, they just continue to fight those children in court. And this is supposed to be a government invested in reconciliation. So we still have a big issue around truth before we can get to any actions. So, we could talk about this all day. And these are the things that I'm happy to talk about in the after conversation with you. I'm happy to bring these up and sort of reflect upon issues of land, for example, like the fact is that, this whole issue around New Brunswick, New Brunswick is refusing to use the terms unceded because 60% of their province is under court challenge involving land claims by Indigenous nations. Well, at some point we have to face the reality that New Brunswick's stolen, like most of Canada. Vancouver, stolen. BC, stolen. Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Alberta, stolen. And we have to talk about this at some point, and simply erasing the word unceded, never mind the fact bureaucrats have been saying it for upwards in a decade now, doesn't somehow change the fact that it's stolen. So truth is yet still under negotiation in elements of the country. laws, governance, poverty. I could talk about all of these different things. What I think is the biggest, if you were to ask me which is the one that I think is the most underdeveloped or underaddressed, it's the issue of Indigenous men being those who are, we have this issue of toxic masculinity, and we have this issue of absent fathers and absent uncles, for the most part, because many of them are either in jail or encouraged to never stay home with their families, with their children, and in this hyper masculine world, encouraged to go out and somehow sow your oats or, win $1 million or whatever it might be. The fact is that our communities don't work like that. Indigenous men should be fostered and taught and engaged and supported in staying home, staying in their communities, building a fire. That's what ultimately we should be encouraging our young men to do. And it's not that they shouldn't go out and be stockbrokers or business leaders, or they're probably going to find that those professions aren't the most satisfying for being able to fulfill their responsibilities as an Anishinaabe or Cree person. But at the same time, I'm not here to argue with them. If they want to be a business leader, they want to go out and be, teacher, dentist, whatever it might be. It is that they have responsibilities at home. And, no Indigenous person goes to school to get a diploma. Let me say it again. No Indigenous person goes to school to get a diploma. They go there to become better Indigenous peoples. If getting a diploma is a part of that, that means that that diploma has then therefore turned into a responsibility, meaning you go back to your community and to support your communities, to support others to get diplomas, to support others to build up, to cure this horrible ill of poverty. That's what we send our young people to school for. It's not to leave. Not one Indigenous community has ever sent their child to school to leave. They have asked them to come home and to contribute and to help us, just like you would 500 years ago, just like you would in 2021. All of these different challenges that are facing us are centered, right in solutions that we can see right before us. And I want to show you very quickly what Winnipeg is like. And in the last 15, 20 minutes here that I have, this remarkable video tells us a little bit about how reconciliation in this place is happening in a really remarkable way through relationships in everyday society. And this is a good video that you could show in your social studies classroom. This is the first national event of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which happened right here in Winnipeg.
From June 16th to 19th, 2010, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada held its first of 7 national events at the Fork site in Winnipeg. The event started with the sunrise ceremony and the lighting of a sacred fire.
For us, the spirit is the one who helps us and leads us, eh? So we don't ever forget that. So all the time before we do ceremonies or events like that, we have our ceremony before we do the work. So we ask for that guidance.
Good morning, bonjour.
Morning pipe ceremonies were held that included survivors and representatives from the churches among the participants.
It puts my spirit a little lighter, very light, really, because I've never experienced something like this before. I mean, we have our own ceremonies and, within our own, but to have all these different people participating in this, it feels good.
The highlight, I think, is the fact is Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people met around a fire that represents healing and reconciliation.
What you have when you're doing a pipe ceremony then is you have the whole universe looking in on you. To see all these people here, to know that, of all of one mind, everybody share their tobacco and put their thoughts and their prayers into that tobacco.
Wednesday's official opening ceremony set the stage for a 4-day event that would include survivors and over 40,000 other Canadians.
We have a chance while we're involved with the work of the Commission and while you are here to make history and to be part of history. I hope that the time will come in your lives when you can look back at this day and say that this was an important day in the way that things have evolved in this country.
For healing is the hidden word in our TRC mandate. Healing is the purpose behind truth. It is the purpose behind reconciliation. As our mandate says so very powerfully, Truth and reconciliation activities will promote the healing that will set our spirits free.
Through this effort with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, through your strength to tell the stories, to tell the truth, that this country will understand. And it's by understanding that we can begin to bridge those deep gaps of misunderstanding that have plagued us for so long, that created deep conflict. And acts of reconciliation can take many forms. We will support, we encourage full participation with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We're encouraged that Canada is taking steps to endorse the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, recognizing our people, and as my late grandmother said, to see us as Indigenous nations.
After the opening ceremonies, the survivors marched across the site to the first commissioners' sharing circle, where survivors were invited to speak and have the commissioners and other dignitaries bear witness.
I'd like to thank you for taking time to listen, and I don't want to apologize for being emotional, because we've been at this for 30 years. We've been asking to be heard for 30 years. We now have a voice. We can start breathing again. We can start living again. And I want to thank you for that opportunity, and the opportunity that we give our people to heal and grow together.
To make sure that we do everything we can to make sure that the record is complete, that we turn over every rock, that we make every supreme effort to make sure that we get that kind of information and that we work together so that we can, that you can get some peace.
Okay, do you all see that? Let me go back to just a second here. In this moment, this is Chuck Stroll. Chuck Stroll is the former Minister of Indigenous Affairs. A survivor who in that moment, just a few minutes earlier, was breaking down, talking about the wanting to be heard, wanting to be seen, and that she's emotional because she is seen and she is a part of a conversation. She is partaking in change. Chuck Stroll realizes that he is a part of the change too. Notice that as soon as he says, "give you peace," he realized that the peace that he really needs is with himself. And that's what Canadians are looking for. Canadians are looking for peace in the realization this country is so violent, is so genocidal, and that has built the very world around them. And that Indigenous peoples, while we have been talking and sharing and engaging and offering our tobacco for so long, it perhaps for the first time in places like Winnipeg is being acknowledged and taken, and then action is happening. And the action that takes place happens when that survivor reaches her hand in a remarkable moment, one of the most remarkable moments I've ever seen in my entire life. A survivor consoles the Minister of Indigenous Affairs. Like, do we all realize how much kindness, generosity, and humility must it be in that moment? You know, how much, what is the revolution other than love and commitment and family? And this isn't some optimistic or rose-colored glasses vision. This is what education's all about. If we were to ever get to a point of reconciliation, and we're not there yet, in most sections of the country, frankly, we're still debating the truth. There's still, we still have a minister out in Montreal saying, "Oh, I don't know if the Canadians could say a territorial acknowledgement or not." Like, the racism in Quebec is well documented and it speaks for itself. But the fact is that in areas of the country, there is important moments happening, and despite of what happens in, the leadership of places like Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, there are people there who are fighting just like people here have been fighting to make sure that the audacity of love finds its way into our relationships, because it is love that has been the most absent, that has been removed the most, it has been the humanity that has been denied by the king way back in 1763 and then made law in Canada. It has been the fact that we have been taught to see each other as different, as somehow one lesser and one superior, as one who is the problem and one who is the solver. And ultimately, it is in this moment, this tiny scene right here, where the Minister of Indigenous Affairs and a survivor realize both that they are in this together. And just like during treaty time, that survivor reaches over and touches the minister. There's nothing more hopeful than that, but I'll try this. The reality is this, the reality is that Indigenous peoples are the fastest growing population in the country. And you as teachers are seeing that in your classrooms. Whenever a teacher ever says to me, I don't have Indigenous students in my classroom, my first question is, why don't you think they're talking about it? Because the fact is, Indigenous peoples are in your classroom, and whether they are talking about it or not is the issue. And if they aren't talking about it, that's on you. That's on your school. That's on your culture and your environment. The fact that people aren't proud, aren't talking about it. And yes, if there aren't any Indigenous peoples per se with ancestry, with status, with relationships and communities, membership in communities, that may be the case in certain segments of the country. But the fact is that in the classroom right next door, I'm sure there is one, there's probably two, there's probably three, and certainly in the building that you are working in, there are. The fact is that we are in a society in which Indigenous peoples are exponentially growing. And we are exponentially growing more than ever, particularly in segments of the Métis population. I'm not here to tell you what to think about that, but I would say that it's about who you claim, no, it's about who claims you, not who you claim. Just because you have an ancestor doesn't make you Métis. Just because you have a Cree grandmother doesn't make you Métis. It makes you having an opportunity to have a relationship with an Indigenous community. That means you have responsibility. No Indigenous person comes to the feast and it just comes empty-handed, or comes to a community and says, oh, well, I'm here to take whatever I want and then leave. Every person who comes to our community is expected to do work, pick up the dishes, do the chopping of the wood, help build the lodge. Like, you're expected to do work. And so you can't just simply claim to be a Métis or Cree or Anishinaabe or Mo. You can't just claim it on a Friday by checking a box. You have to take responsibilities when you decide that you want that in your life. And again, it's about who claims you. When people start calling you cousin, when people start recognizing that you're a part of communities. And then, of course, they're going to ask you who your family is. Where did your family come from? Where did they go? That kind of thing. So, but, more and more Indigenous peoples are everywhere in the country, 42.5%. And the fact is this, that we are growing exponentially, probably the most in Quebec and Ontario. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a minute. But the average Indigenous age is between 5 and 19. The average Canadian age is between 35 and 59. Like, these are really significant numbers because they tell you something very significant. And it's that the population of Canada is aging, retirement. Who do you think is going to fill this up? Who do you think is going to fill it in? And particularly in segments where the largest proportional population are in the red dots. That's Manitoba, that's Saskatchewan, that's Alberta, that's British Columbia. But then also look over here, Toronto and Montreal. Look at these red dots here. Exponentially growing, big red dots added together would actually be larger than Winnipeg. But Winnipeg is not the most racist city in the galaxy, regardless of what Maclean's magazine says about it. We are the front lines of what has been 150 years of violence. So naturally, we would see racism in this place. Naturally, we would also see solutions in this place. Because the fact is that every single person in this community lives with, works with, sits on a bus beside, or is married to an Indigenous person. In Manitoba, 20% of us are Indigenous. That means that 1/5 of every client, 1/5 of every person that enters a business, 1/5 of every person that steps on a bus, Indigenous. And that means that if you cannot work effectively with Indigenous peoples, you do not deserve to have a job in Manitoba. And frankly, Saskatchewan and Alberta, and soon to be Vancouver, BC, soon to be Ontario, Quebec. So working with Indigenous peoples positively is going to be the most employable skill going forward into the future. It might just be the only thing that helps Canada survive, because if we continue to throw Indigenous young people into jails, if we continue to throw them into the child welfare system, and you know, there are many people who are fighting this tooth and nail with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, you know, ostracizing them in the healthcare system, ostracizing them in the justice system. You know, the fact is that if you're an Indigenous young person, you're more likely to get diabetes or go to jail than you are to get a diploma. And so this is the fact. And if we don't change that, but particularly if we don't change the fact that non-Indigenous peoples need to work with Indigenous peoples effectively, because if they don't, they're a problem for the rest of us. They hold racist views, they hold divisive ideas, they go and they become premiers of provinces and then eventually have to be removed by their own province. Oh, I wonder who I'm talking about there, Brian Pallister in Manitoba. You know, I think it's remarkable that in Manitoba, the very first time in history happened about 3 months ago, where this province could not tolerate a premier with racist, divisive language any longer. They actually removed him. His own party removed him. They were going to remove him before he resigned. There was a letter circulating to say that all the people in the Progressive Conservative Party had to remove him, because it wasn't the fact he closed ERs or mishandled the pandemic, although he did that. It was the fact that he kept saying racist things about Native people and wrong things. And they said, well, that's enough. We got to remove you. That's a sign of what's happening in Canada's future, is that if you cannot work effectively with Indigenous peoples, you cannot survive in your place of employment. And so to be an employable person, you have to be able to work effectively with Indigenous peoples. And that may just be what the future holds for us, because the biggest issue is, how are we going to live together? And what I would say, in the audacity and most egregious way possible, it is the revolution of love. It is the revolution of commitment, and how we teach our young people how to give to one another, how to help rebuild one another, how to commit to a future in which we refuse any longer to not see those who we have been taught not to see, and then particularly to take it upon ourselves to teach our children to sit together, to learn together, and most importantly, to make the revolution together. That's what I wanted to share with you for today, and said that if reconciliation is possible in any way, it will be ultimately to say, how are we going to live? How are we going to share this? How are we going to make a future together? So with that, I say huge miigwech, and thank you very much for inviting me to the Social Studies Educators Forum, and also for the wonderful opportunity that Kevin has offered to me to speak to you. I know that you have many different speakers and many different things you have yet to do in this conference, but I just want to say a huge miigwech for you for offering me this time. It's an incredible gift for you to spend a little bit of time listening. I hope that you enjoyed what I had to offer for today, and I'm happy to stick around for questions. Or I know that I've actually got another session following this, so you're happy to take it upon yourself to comment or challenge or ask questions or whatever you want to do in the half hour that we're together after this. So I'll hand it back to Kevin. Miigwech, everybody.
Niigaan, thank you so much. That was incredible. You know what? So much. I could listen to you talk all day. I learn so much every time I hear from you. So thank you. And I love just your beginning. That love is the one element that has not been given to Indigenous people, and we need to work on that and the relationship. So. I think I know people probably have questions, but what I'm going to do is just recommend that people check out your concurrence session that starts at 1 o'clock. So people have a chance to visit our exhibitors and see some recorded sessions up to that point. And then you can rejoin us at 1 o'clock for Dr. Sinclair's breakout session. So thank you again. So powerful. Niigaan, and we'll meet back at 1 o'clock in the breakout session.
Miigwech, and do I use the same link? I'm sorry to ask that question right here, but do I just stay on this link, or is there a whole new link?
There will be another one. We'll make sure.
Okay. Yep. Yeah, send me that link if you can. I'm sorry, I've so many different things on today that I lose track of everything. So, okay, miigwech, everybody. Take care of yourself.
Thanks, everyone.